Welcome to today's Corporate Venturing Insider series. I am so happy today to have Francesco Di Lorenzo from the Copenhagen Business School. Francesco, welcome.
Thank you very much, Nicolas, and good morning to you.
So, Francesca, I like to ask how people got into corporate venturing. You've been studying corporate venturing, you are passionate about the topic. Tell me why.
Yeah, so first of all, I entered into this field approximately 10 years ago. Reason why, because I started my career in consulting. So I did quite some consulting, especially in large firms, strategic and financial. So that made me learn a lot about how firms works, and particularly was about creating new solutions in financial sector. So there was this trigger for innovation. I've been always curious about entrepreneurship. There was this idea of the dialogue. So in my PhD studies, I got very fascinated by the work of Schumpeter, Arrow, so all these economists or sociologists of economics. They somehow put a lot of attention in the interaction between large firms and new entrants, so startup, and how the economy get affected by it. So I was really fascinated by this dialogue between the two. So at some point, I was actually giving talk around for my research that initially was about inventors' mobility, right? And then someone was across firms, right? And how competition changed in that sense. For example, if a Google engineer moved to Samsung or the other way around. And then someone told me, hey, but you know that some of these people actually go to startups themselves. I say, yeah, I know. But do you know that actually some of these people get even money from the previous large corporates? Say, no, that's kind of new. And that has been my last 10 years.
Wow. So we have 10 years of research and interest and passion to dissect. So one of the things that when I researched what you did, I liked a lot is you look at the full corporate venturing, not just the CVC. And so let me start with the Shakespeare line, to CVC or not to CVC?
It's a very, very relevant, timely question, especially nowadays. So I think the answer stands into the maybe 20 years ago when the first data were kind of available and collected, right? And colleagues move steps into the understanding of what CVC. The answer to this CVC or not to CVC has been immediately answered like, yes, let's CVC. Why? Because most of the research suggests that positive effects for firms, both financially speaking and innovation, so investing in startup increase innovation. This has been the mantra, if you want, for until today. The question is, I think, before going to the CVC, not CVC, which is a very much today question, the question passed through the idea of, okay, CVC, yes, but how? So in the last decade or so, people in academia interested in corporate venture has been much more digging into the, okay, we do it, but how do we do it? And some hints have been also pointing to maybe we should not do it under certain circumstances. And so this is actually when nowadays a lot of firms in practice are retracting their commitment to CVC and going to the non-CVC. So the question is, to me on the table here is, okay, if it's not CVC, then what else? Incubator, accelerator feels already kind of internal venturing, since a little bit outdated in a way, and not non-valuable, absolutely valuable, but kind of more outdated because fundamentally reflect much more like initial starting steps of corporate in learning how to do venturing from a corporate perspective. Nowadays, it's much more about, I want to have something to do with startup, what can I do? And so this is where the kind of the new boy in the hood, as I call it, so the venture clienting is actually coming up and being the sort of the response to, okay, if a CVC is not, then what else? Then currently firms are looking much more into this venture clienting model. And so for me, this is becoming kind of a journey in which firms move from the idea of investing to collaborating. But the idea is actually really not looking at CVC as the only platform where to actually develop corporate venturing, but in fact, looking at the possibilities, given that acquisition may be very, very risky, especially in the times of deep tech in which we are nowadays. So probably collaborating can be a new response.
Now, one thing which I think you mentioned it earlier, I think during EUVC, I think you mentioned is a new kid on the block and it's collaboration, is a venture clienting. Why is it more popular now and why was it not popular 10 years ago when you started your research?
So corporates, to me, I've learned to be very much in love with control. So in that sense, the necessity to go through an investing tool was not only inspired by VC model as a way to obviously tap into opportunities, but it's also because it gives some sort of control. Even if you look at the data in the Nordics, very high share of Nordic corporates, they acquire board positions in startup related to their investment. So one answer here is probably corporate has to learn that control is not what matters in being successful in corporate venturing. Two, I think that corporate venturing, in the end of the day, could be a very likely another way of calling a strategic partnership with startups. So the corporate is much more mindful into the structure of this collaboration. So then, fundamentally, the idea is that any strategic alliances, just part of it with venture. So the difference with the venture client, if you wish, nowadays got a lot of traction, is because eventually now we really clearly understand the startup are there for corporate to solve problems or looking at opportunities. But again, even future opportunities are a response to probably a current problem that we want to kind of move timely to solve it. In that sense, we could actually in somehow become the first client so they can scale up. We can actually get our solution. Everybody's kind of happy. So now I'm relatively critical about this, and I give you my points of criticism, if you wish, about this venture clienting because, well, as you mentioned, we've been talking also 1 year ago almost in a Combient and Foundry Maersk event, also in Copenhagen by Maersk, with Jeppe Hoyer from EUVC was also moderating. And I was giving my 2 cents in this beautiful morning in which Combient Foundry obviously cracked the model very well in the Nordics, at the very least, to understand how to help corporate to in somehow collaborate with startups for venture clienting models. Maersk has an entire division, strategic partnership, and this is absolutely a great example. But then I came in and say, okay, let me give you a couple of reasons why we should be careful. So first of all, there is a very, let me say, underestimation about the OpEx. While the CVC is mostly, let me say, a little bit more wrongly so, let's say more like a CapEx type of business. So fundamentally, there is an equity allocated. It's capital that we actually care about. Venture clienting is about OpEx. So you need a lot of people from the operation that dialogue with the startup, usually mediated by the unit internally. So how do we capture all these OpEx? Is a little bit more difficult. In the end of the day, isolating those OpEx is not so easy. And if we do, I bet that there will be much less attractive opportunities than we believe they are, first of all. Second, there is actually an issue of governance. So corporate has not been proving themselves to be the best in dealing with startups. The typical example, the gazelle versus the elephant or whatever not has been used into the ecosystem, right? So I believe that is an issue. Every single startup complains about how slow are the corporate, how bureaucratic are the corporate. And even from my survey in the Nordics, the corporate venture capital unit, they complain about the bureaucracy as first number one problem of having corporate venture initiative, bureaucracy with the parent company. So bureaucracy seems to be an issue. So why is not going to be in venture clienting? That's just an assumption. It will be in my expectations. That represents a hidden cost that is at the moment a little bit more disregarded. And third, I would say there is also issues for startups to be limited in the growth. 3 years ago, a big scale up in the Nordics, which has been financed by one of the leading CVC in the Nordics, told a story about this. And they said that another European, a very big corporate investor, had been approaching this startup and say, well, we're actually happy to invest and to collaborate also together. But in the end of the day, you're not going to be able to collaborate with many other competitors that we have. And also, we want to have a kind of a primary type of relationship. The startup very courageously, so I would say, said, no thanks. I mean, I would love to, but no thanks. While the actual corporate that entered the cap table was the one saying, look, I can see in your solution a very good problem solving for me, but I can see that I can actually bring you to many other verticals and even in my actual value chain. So that was a wonderful marriage that speaks to one problem here in corporate venture clienting, which is what happened is the client is a corporate that is a little bit more dominating and cutting off opportunity for the venture as opposed to. So this will, in equilibrium, if you wish, let me use this word, maybe creating a market for lemons. So only startups that actually are okay in running the risk of being cut off in business opportunity might actually accept to have a client, big client, as a corporate. I don't have the data for this. It's a pure speculation, but I'm going to look into this because it might very well be happening. So in conclusion, yes, it's a new model from investing to collaboration. It's a way that is very appealing now to corporate because it's cheaper, apparently. But my challenge here is that I don't know how cheaper that will be and how less risky that would be because it implies collaborative development from the corporates.
I think there are quite a few golden nuggets, but I'm going to try to reframe it in a way that I understand it from you. One is, I think, this OpEx, CapEx, but what's interesting is that the venture clienting is kind of a hidden OpEx. It's not clear, it's not all allocated necessarily to the venture clienting unit, but actually probably across the organization.
Precisely.
But if it was measured in a very strict way, it's not obvious, to your point. While in a way, CVC is extremely visible, OpEx maybe small for the team, but definitively visible for the CapEx. Whether
Yeah.
you're from the balance sheet or away from the balance sheet is very visible. So I think that's one thing. I think one reflection I have is also, if you think about corporate VC, it's about unlearning what you've learned to be best practices in corporations, which is in corporations, you learn to act according to a distribution law type of outcomes and consensus and decision making according to that. While venture capital is power law, very different, conviction based. So you need to unlearn. Venture clienting, the way you've described it, sounds to me like this is what corporations know what to do, how to do well, and it's about putting the structure to actually even optimize further, fine-tuning further that process.
I completely agree. I just want to add one thing, another layer of complexity. Once a unit gets established, whether we call it venture clienting, we call it venturing, we call it a strategic partnership, it doesn't matter. Once a venture clienting unit gets established, it will have its own incentive to survive and necessities to survive. So that means that the KPI, which is another huge topic in corporate venturing, that will actually create a potential risk, because the incentive of a strategic partnership unit will be to create those partnerships. That will be the first KPI. Have you created any? Have you solved any problem? So what I learned informally, talking to quite some of those units, the more or less successful, and then there is this push versus pull type of approach. Is the unit that goes to the operation and say, I think you have this problem, and that's a solution I found down there. It's called Venture X, and then what you should use. Or is rather the operation that they go and say, this is our problem, can you go and find? Okay, so what are the issues here? The first one is a not invented yet syndrome that can be triggered if it's too much a solution pushed top down to the operations. On the other hand, the operation might actually requires an effort to look for a startup, establish a relationship, formalizing the relationship maybe for a problem that does not deserve such a level of OpEx. Okay, so this is where I see the tension very much into this, which makes the topic very fascinating per se.
I think I will add one more layer, but I think it's linked to what you just said. If you think corporate VCs, it takes a long time to see the result.
Yeah.
Venture clienting, if it's done well, and Crispin is one of the best practice I think that is shared, it's all about, maybe it's too simplistic, but quick wins. You find good partnerships with the startups and you get these partnerships. And if you do enough of them, you're going to have success stories quite early on. On top of that, you're probably going to build friendship with different business groups who are going to be repeat customers in a way. And so while on CVC, you may actually end up being challenged for not bringing results after 4 years, which is the half-life of a CVC. Venture clienting has probably more chance to show results over time, multiple times, and get these repeat internal customers, and therefore potentially be more resilient than even a CVC could be.
Yeah. There is one issue there that I see, which enrich even more your very clear description of the dynamic, is incremental versus disruptive innovation. So CVC by nature has the chance to look for the explorative technologies, to look for what literature refers to the windows on technology, right? Looking in the future. Reposition the firms 5 years from now, hopefully, somewhere else. While the short-termism, let me call it in this way, but not in a negative way, just like, as an approach of venture clienting. So we have a problem today, let's solve the problem today, might create a lot of incremental innovation and incremental innovative solutions in the firms. So if you repeated this game for like many interactions, that can happen that the firms unlearn to be explorative. That could be one thing. Second, and that is a disaster because we know that the firms that actually succeed in the medium long terms are the ones that they keep exploration as a mantra in their strategic thinking. Second, we might actually fall in sort of a myopic traps and also local search. So continuously developing the skills of looking for local problems, for local solutions, might actually take our heads down and forget about the larger pictures. And so that is cost, again, that have to be taken into account. So again, my point is that venture clienting is a great solution that can complement CVC. My only criticism here is that I can see a little bit too much hype, let me say, into this venture clienting on the positive upside, but I would like to see more discussion, let's say, on the, I wouldn't say downside, but it is on the limitations and on the risk associated to this.
I think you are probably the toughest critic I've heard of venture clienting, and I think you're making really good points worth researching, because the way you describe it, and you talked about myopia, but it nearly makes me think of this analogy of the frog getting comfortable in the hot water and dying. And I think the way I'm thinking is, if you only do venture clienting, of course you have to look at the short term, the local maxima. You're not going to look at what could kill the corporation 5 years from now. And so you might feel this sense of comfort and safety, which is probably a false sense of safety, because you're just going with what you can see short term versus what could kill you 5-7 years from now, and prepare for, which a CVC with an exploration mission should do.
Absolutely. So what could be the solution, therefore, to this dilemma? Not the solution, but a solution, okay, that I've been thinking about, right, recently. And I got inspired by some cases. I think the response is standing in an organizational or governance strategizing by corporate. What do I mean with this? So too many players are substituting CVC effort with venture clienting effort. That could be a cycle effects due to the economic challenges that we have in the general global ecosystem, but it might actually well be the attitude to say, "Oh, this is what we did. It didn't work, so now we try something else." What is actually potentially like a more optimal response? Creating a unit of venturing where the two identities are coexisting, not necessarily overlapping, and coordinated. And I want to give you an example here, which is, for example, Mass Growth, right? There's a local champion in Nordics, where within Mass Growth, there is literally the unit more dedicated to CVC, so investing. There is the unit dedicated to venture clienting, strategic partnership. And then there is a unit, if you wish, that is kind of looking at the ecosystem to potentially trying to create a sort of a trade union among these two mentality, investing and collaborating. And they all report to the strategic line back immediately, not so far, to the TMT CEO and boardroom, where they can actually have some relevance in fact. Therefore, two responses here. First is organizing for innovation. That is a key, kind of a buzzword. And do it also in venturing. Create two units for this and keep both the goal alive. Where do I want to be 5 years from now? What do I need today? And how can I use ventures for this? So second is, let's make sure that the board is committed. So I have another kind of a way that I've developed recently to say is that from skin in the game to board in the game, right? What do I mean for this? What I mean is that these 4 years approximately lifetime of a venturing unit obviously is very much triggered by many reasons. One is because board is not committed. And when board is not committed, as we all know, things might go down very quickly and change the operations and the organizational structure very quickly.
Francesco, I really appreciated you sharing your views, and especially you start with that passion from 10 years ago. And I think you're bringing a critical view on so many different approaches to corporate venturing. And maybe my last question for you, is there anything left that actually you believe is super exciting or is the best model?
Okay, so exciting, I think, is what I call the dark side. There is a lot of attention into the bright side. So does it work? Does not work? So we started also our interview in a way from CVC or not to CVC. And we know it works. The question is how, and how can we make it work better? But there is a dark side. This has been there are very, very few research papers in the last 20 years, actually, even. And what we actually look at is when startup wants to have a corporate investor that could potentially misappropriate ideas. And this is something that we see in course all the time, right? Ventures are afraid they might not enter into this. Something that I think we should also pay more attention into it is the frictions between the startup and the corporate. And nowadays, the narrative is much more about the organizational culture that are different and that create cost. But for me, it's also about strategic intent. So the corporate does not come with just as a charity. It comes with some objectives, and if those objectives collide too much, that could create a lot of potential misappropriation. Also, because the best corporate investors in a venture is also the one coming from the same industry most of the time. And that can create a potential competitive dynamics that we saw in the data becoming actually possibly an equity investment that is done by the corporate for which they get much more equity for the money that they put, because a startup will be happy to give up some of the equity for less money to avoid the misappropriation effect. And to your last point about the best model, there is no best model yet, but I'm working on it to trying to kind of understand if there is any and what and how that look like.
Francesco, thank you so much for your time today.
Nicola, it's been a pleasure. And yeah, let's cheer to the corporate venture in the global community.